A perennial feature of American society is the importance of race in determining individual economic and social outcomes. For more than 400 years, race has played a fundamental role in shaping this nation. Indeed, race is central to much of the development of contemporary capitalism since at least the second half of the 19th century. The role of race in shaping economic outcomes is multiple. It shapes how individuals are perceived within the economy, mirroring in many ways some of the features that we explored in terms of gender roles and gender expectations. Racism fundamentally shapes how individuals are perceived in terms of their worth, their abilities, and their potential as economic agents. Similarly, race has an impact on how we construct societies, both materially and institutionally, through the way we deploy, for example, neighborhoods that become hyper segregated, to the way we construct organizations that reproduce particularly racialized notions of the world. An important lesson from this module is understanding that discriminating across any feature is economically illogical. Indeed, what we observe in contemporary societies, discrimination across race, gender, country of origin, and social class, often leads to suboptimal economic outcomes. This is an observation that was made quite eloquently and interestingly by the economist Gary Becker, who, in The Economics of Discrimination, explored how discrimination leads us to select individuals, solutions, and institutions that are not the most efficient for the goals that we are pursuing. One of the papers that we will explore during this week explores this quite well. Using an experimental setup, the authors of this paper show how perceptions of race shape the way rational traders act in experimental markets. In markets that are more homogeneous, race plays a fundamental role in creating overconfidence in the judgments of others. In markets that are more diverse, the outcomes are a bit closer to those predicted by economic theory. This is an example of how diversity is critical, essential, and important for better economic outcomes. Despite the importance of diversity in market outcomes, we know from a vast number of studies and surveys that racial inequalities are a persistent feature of contemporary economies. These gaps are compounded with inequalities in the access that different racial groups have to services from very early on in their lives. Recall that early formation is a critical part of a person's ability to succeed in the economy. This is indeed what social class offers. People from higher social classes are better insulated to fight in the economy because they were given tools to do so very early on in their lives. Race has configured access to different resources in numerous ways. One of the manifestations of this is the way race intersects the construction of contemporary cities. Residential segregation, in particular, has particularly pernicious effects. Given its ties to educational access and access to other basic infrastructures that are critical in producing success, residential segregation creates frictions and stickiness in racial inequalities that are extremely difficult to challenge. In addition to this, the stereotypes around race, the overt and implicit discrimination associated to race makes challenging racial inequalities ever more complicated. An example of this is given by the labor market. Numerous studies have documented how race is central to the way institutions, organizations, and managers identify the worth of employees and prospective hires. In resumes, for example, signals that identify an individual as being from a non-white background often lead to lower callback rates when compared to white candidates. What I want us to do this week is examine the various aspects of these forms of economic discrimination. After seeing the benefits of diversity in economic outcomes, I want us to consider how different forms of economic institutions, from neighborhoods to firms, create inequality through race. I also want you to be very clear and very aware of how race intersects other important variables of interest. Race is central to the inequalities of American societies and their economies. And by understanding how race plays a role in a number of economic processes, we can think, perhaps, of a better way of creating economic institutions that will be for the benefit of all and not just a few.